Okay, so welcome. We're talking about Chapter 7 in the textbook, Intro to Dynamic Optimization. Now, you might see that I skipped, I believe, 2 chapters in the text. It's because I think it's stuff that's a little bit more important once we've sort of gotten the gist of what the main chunk of the course is going to be covering, which is theoretical macro models with a sort of dynamic flavor to them. So the point of dynamic optimization is, well, let's just cover up dynamic for a second, just think about optimization. So what we're doing with optimization is we're optimizing. In the framework of economics, what we're sort of doing is we're looking at how agents optimize. We're looking at how agents will maximize, if they're a household, how they'll maximize their utility. If we're looking at firms, we'll think about how firms are maximizing their profit. There are multiple economic agents that we can have in these models, but they're all optimizing. They're all doing the best that they possibly can given the set of constraints that they face. So for a household who would want to maximize their utility, they're going to do so subject to a budget constraint, meaning your income is going to have a certain flow over time. So by considering that, well, it would be great if we could have this level of utility here, but if the constraint only lets us have this level of utility, well, when we maximize utility subject to a budget constraint, this is the highest that we could possibly go. So we're going to start out with some basics. We're going to be starting out first with just how individual agents are maximizing or optimizing. We're going to look at how they maximize their utility, and we're going to do so with exogenous output, meaning we're not looking at how firms produce stuff in here. We're just assuming that in this model, the agents are taking output as given. There's nothing they can really do for output. However, they can choose to either consume today or save today, which means higher levels of consumption tomorrow. So without further ado, let's just get started. So we're going to start in this model with preferences. All right, so what are preferences? Well, really this is sort of the first assumption that we're going to be looking at within the model. Now this model has a single representative agent. What this means is there is only one household in this model. There is only one person in this model. We're assuming this individual person represents all of the preferences of the entire society at large. So we're starting really, really small by looking at just one person. If we can figure out how they're going to optimize based on a number of mathematical assumptions we'll put in place on the utility function, if we figure out how they're going to optimize, then we can expand that outward for the entire economy. So if we get an optimal solution path over time, in the sense that it's dynamic, if we get this optimal solution path, then if we know what this one person is going to do, given, again, like I said, the assumptions that we're putting on the constraint, or not the constraint, well, the constraint and the objective function, if we know how this one person is going to operate, well, we can change a couple of little things, which will all work out mathematically in the solution path, to be able to aggregate it upward for this entire macro economy. Now, this representative agent is, like I said, treated as the only person in the economy. And they choose to maximize their utility over some time horizon. So what this means is they can choose to maximize their utility just for today. They can choose to do it for today and tomorrow, today and the next 2 days, next 3 days, all the way up to n days. Or if we want to have an infinite time horizon, which actually sounds the weirdest, but is the most convenient and expedient way to do it mathematically. They maximize over this infinite time horizon, and they will sort of choose out how they want to consume over this foreseeable time path. Now, what they're maximizing is their utility, which means definition time with Jeremy. A utility function is a function that maps a ranking of possible choices, or you could say alternatives, like it says in the book, to the real number line. So what does that mean? Well, it means we have choices that we can make. There are a plethora of potential options that we can choose that will be altering how happy or how not happy we are. What the utility function does is it takes those preferences. Now, these preferences are abstract. They're hard to mathematically define, right? Like, you're like, well, I want 1 cup of coffee today, or I want 2 cups of coffee today. I needed probably about 3 cups of coffee, and I'm still sort of dragging. But it's kind of hard to go, all right, well, how happy exactly does that make me? Because without any sort of a utility function, you've got no way of knowing, right? You just know that it's going to make you happier until you have too much coffee, and then, you're kind of like for maybe an hour or so, and then you start to die out and crash pretty hard. No, that's not very fun. Nobody wants to go through that. So we have this ranking that we can follow, and it'll go, okay, well, I want 1 cup of coffee. It's going to do this. I want 2 cups of coffee. Well, if 2 cups of coffee is preferable to 1 cup of coffee, then we can rank that. We can go 2 cups of coffee is better than just 1 cup of coffee, right? And in the case of today, 3 cups of coffee is much better than 2 cups, which is also much better than only 1 cup of coffee. So what it's doing is it's allowing us to rank these choices in such a way that we can map them, we can fit them into the real number line. So it lets us measure our preferences by defining them on some metric. So in this model, the agent gets utility from consumption. We'll denote it C with a little subscript t. So we get utility from consuming stuff. Now, if you think like GDP, for example, y equals C plus I plus G, what we're getting here is that we get utility from consumption. Now, investment, which as we'll see in a little bit, is saving. If we get utility from consumption, but consumption and investment are tied together because whatever you're not consuming every period, you are just sort of by default in the initial setup of this model, saving, then whatever you don't consume, you save, meaning whatever isn't consumed this period is rather invested this period. So if we can measure consumption, we can fit that to this utility function that's going to map this ranking of possible choices out to the real number line. If we can measure consumption, we can figure out what investment's going to be. So it's like the nice little tie-in with this. Now, because we get utility from consumption, we would denote utility of consumption as u of CT. So we have a function u with an input or an argument, consumption. Utility of consumption. Now, this utility function can take on a number of functional forms. So there's not just one function that it's going to take. Now, there is one that it's going to take in this class that is used throughout this course. I want to make it easy on you. It's important to me that you learn some of this stuff because this is what actual macroeconomics uses. But I don't want to overburden you with a bunch of mathematics that you really just don't need to know, especially for this level of this course, right? So what we're doing is we're choosing consumption over some time path. So we have consumption today, which gets put into our utility function. So utility of consumption today, utility of consumption tomorrow, utility of consumption 2 days from now, all the way up to utility of consumption t days from now, where t, this capital T, is indicating the terminal period, the endpoint of this time path of consumption. Right, so utility of consumption, U of CT, is increasing in consumption. It's increasing everywhere in consumption. What that means is, if I consume more at any point in time, my utility will be higher. So let's say I've got CT equals 100, right? Or I'll call it CT with a little superscript 0 to indicate the first or the initial level of consumption. If I consume 100 units, then I get U of CT0 equals, say, U of 100. All right, where U is still abstract in this case. We haven't explicitly defined what this utility function is. If an alternative level of consumption, CT with this little superscript 1, all right, if this is an alternative amount of consumption, then I have U of CT prime equals U of 100. Oh, not 100, 110. Because the alternative amount of consumption is 110 units. Because U of CT is increasing in consumption everywhere, meaning there is no level of utility that will be lower by consuming more, then U of CT0, or U of 100 units of consumption, is going to be less than U of CT prime, which would be U of 110 units of consumption. The more I consume, higher my utility. What does this look like? It would probably help to have like a graph or something that we could look at. Now, if you give me just a minute, I'm going to get some more coffee. And I am back with more coffee. Good coffee. So if I consume more stuff, I'm happier. What this looks like drawn out in a graph where I can draw my utility of consumption. I would have utility of consumption on the vertical axis, and I would have my input, consumption, on the horizontal axis. If I draw out my utility of consumption, I get this. So it is increasing everywhere. So if I go, all right, this is (100) units of consumption. Draw my little dotted line up to the blue curve and then over what I have, CT, or is U of CT, or CT superscript 0. However, if I had 110 units of consumption, what I get here is U of CT prime. The more I consume, the higher level of utility. Because this is utility in levels. We'll get to marginal utility in just a second. But utility of consumption, as we can see, is increasing everywhere. So what I'll say, utility increases if we increase how much we consume, and it always increases if we increase how much we consume. But for those of you that have had calculus, that really love calculus, we notice, right, it's got a positive slope. So got a positive slope. And because it has a positive slope, its first derivative is always going to be positive. What does that mean? Well, the first derivative of utility first derivative of the utility function is marginal utility. Oh, we got a bug. Cool, I think I got it. I guess I can say animals were harmed in the making of this video. So the first derivative of utility is marginal utility. You've probably heard that before. If you've taken any sort of econ courses, which I believe there is at least one prerequisite econ course, possibly two, for you to take this class. The first derivative of utility is marginal utility. What is marginal utility? What does marginal utility tell us? Well, marginal utility in this case tells me how much more utility I'll get from consuming one more unit of consumption. So if, say, this was discrete, then marginal utility would be, let's say, if CT0 is 10, CT prime is 11, which is mu usually for marginal utility, or in our case, u prime of CT would be u of CT prime minus u of CT0 equals u of 11 minus u of 10. So the utility from consuming 11 units minus the utility of consuming 10 units. It's telling me how much utility I'm gaining at the margin from consuming one more unit of consumption, right? But if we look at u of CT here, we can figure out what marginal utility is, but we're not seeing it explicitly. All right, we have to go, okay, well, what's the utility at this point? What's the utility at this point? And we have to find what the difference is between them. Well, I don't know about you, I could think of easier ways to try to figure out what marginal utility would be if I'm looking at just this guy right here. Namely, if I knew what the utility function was, I could take its derivative and figure out what marginal utility is by just, well, plotting it out on the graph. So instead of looking at utility in levels here, we're going to be looking at utility the margin. As economists, we always think on the margin, right? We always think about what the marginal benefit, the marginal cost would be. All right, what's the marginal benefit from consuming one more unit of good? What is the marginal cost going to be? All right, if I want to engage in some policy, well, what is the benefit of that policy going to be on the margin? What is the benefit of that policy going to be at the aggregate, right? What is the cost of that policy going to be at the margin? What's the cost going to be at the aggregate? We want to consider both. But what we're really looking at, what we're more concerned with, I guess, would be what's going on at the margin. So we look at marginal utility. So instead of having u of CT, right, utility at the level, Instead, we have U prime of CT, utility at the margin. Now, U prime of CT looks a little different. Looks like this, where utility was increasing everywhere, marginal utility is decreasing everywhere. Right, why is marginal utility decreasing everywhere? Well, we have, as I'm sure you remember hearing from principles of micro, diminishing marginal utility. The more we consume at the level, the happier we get. So I'll say if we consume more, total utility increases. What that means in slightly more mathematical terms is that U of CT is increasing in consumption. However, a really big but. Very big but we need to consider here. It increases by less and less with more that we consume. So if I go from 100 units to 110 units of consumption, total utility will increase. But if I go from 110 to 120 units of consumption, total utility still increases. But it increases by less than it did if I went from 100 units up to 110 units. Which gives me the concept of diminishing marginal utility, meaning the more I consume, the less on the margin utility is increasing. So utility is increasing everywhere, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. So I'm going to draw out utility and marginal utility, and you can see what's going on. So utility at the levels, or total utility, is increasing. Yet as we increase, the rate at which it's increasing is slowing. Right? Think of like a roller coaster. Right? Who doesn't love roller coasters? I love roller coasters. It's like my favorite thing ever. Right? As you're going up that hill, so like you do the first drop, whee, it's all fun, and you're scared and shit. And you go up that next hill. As you're going up that hill, right, the ride, it's increasing, right? And the height of the ride is going up. But as you're increasing in height, your speed starts to slow down. That's what we're seeing here. All right, it's that part of the hill on that roller coaster right before you really start to get launched out of your seat. You're like, oh my God, this is like the best thing ever. So we're increasing, utility is increasing, but it increases at a decreasing rate. Marginal utility, on the other hand, is this. U prime of CT is decreasing. Why? Because this is telling me the speed of this roller coaster. This is telling me the height of the roller coaster. This tells me the speed of the roller coaster. So as the roller coaster gets higher and higher and higher, its speed gets lower and lower and lower. As I consume more and more stuff. All right, if we think of this, I will assume everybody in this class is of legal drinking age. We think of this like drinking. Well, you've had a rough day at work, you had a rough couple of exams, rough day doing a lot of homework, or, I don't know, watching the lecture video for this class. You're like, you know what, screw it. I could really use a beer. All right, well, one beer is going to make you a lot happier than no beers. Unless, of course, you're not really into the alcohol thing, in which case, a cup of coffee, glass of water, any other outlet. All right, 1 unit of that makes you a lot happier than no units of that. But what happens if you have a second beer, or a second cup of coffee, second glass of water, second Coca-Cola, second whatever your outlet is? Well, you'll be happier, but you won't maybe be as happy as like that first beer, right? When I used to wait tables, I did so in Savannah, Georgia at a steak restaurant. Don't want to get in trouble or anything, but it rhymes with schmoutback. And, well, I'd sometimes have a really rough day at work. Sometimes it wasn't always the best thing in the world. And I used to smoke cigarettes too at the time. So like a beer and a cigarette after a long day at work, oh my God, it was like the best thing ever. But you have the second beer, the second cigarette, okay, you're a little bit better. Third beer, third cigarette, maybe we're kind of starting to slow down a little bit on how much happier we're getting. And then by, 7th, 8th beer, right, well, you're getting drunker for sure, but you're not getting that much happier than you were before you had that additional beer. So my total utility of beer consumption is always going to increase. But the amount that I'm getting happier, the amount that I'm able to relax by, starts diminishing. And it diminishes rather rapidly. So the more beer I get, the happier I am, but the amount that I'm being made happier is getting smaller and smaller and smaller as I consume more and more beer. So what that means mathematically, oh, there's a weird little voice thing there. It's like when my voice cracked, I was like, Raggy. What I can gather from that is utility is concave. So if utility is concave, it's got a positive first derivative and a negative second derivative. So if the first derivative is positive everywhere, the slope of the initial function is positive everywhere. So because I'm talking about first levels and then at the margin, so I'm talking about the initial function and then its first derivative, then I go from the first derivative to the second derivative, you're probably going like, what the hell is this guy talking about? Well, what this says is, given u of ct, if the first derivative of utility is positive, the slope of u of ct is positive. So if I take the first derivative of my utility function and it's positive, that tells me the slope of that utility function is always positive. The more I consume, the happier I get. Given u of ct, u double prime of ct, the second derivative of utility of consumption is negative if I've got u of ct, u prime of ct is positive, which means u of ct is upward sloping everywhere. If I've got u of ct, u double prime of ct is negative, meaning that utility is increasing, right? Because that's from the first derivative, but the rate at which it's increasing is negative. So for any function, say f of x, we have this graph of f of x, where it's increasing, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. It's increasing, so its first derivative, right? Because remember, the first derivative gives the velocity, it gives the rate of change of something, right? It's increasing because it's got an upward slope, so its velocity is positive, but the acceleration, the rate of change of the rate of change, is negative. So it's increasing at a decreasing rate. Now, because any 2 points on the utility function that I choose to select will generate a line. If I want to connect those 2 points with a straight line, that straight line will always be underneath the curve. So if I want to play a little game of connect the dots with any 2 dots that I pick on this function u of ct, this line will always be underneath the curve defined by u of ct. All right, so if I just switch out this f of x with u of ct, this x, obviously with ct, well, point, the line that connects them falls underneath the curve that's connecting them on the function. That makes it concave. So if this happens, it's concave, and it's increasing,
decreasing rate. So now that I've got some of the basic mathematical structures lined out of this utility function, now I can go a little bit further and show you the utility function and what it's going to look like over multiple points in time. Because so far I've only looked at one point. We've only looked at consumption today, meaning we've only looked at utility of consumption today. Now, utility itself is not a function of time. So the utility function today, right, the function that we're plugging consumption into, is no different today than it is tomorrow or the next day or the next day. The function is always the same. The input, though, changes over time. So consumption will change over time, but utility itself will never change over time. One moment, please. Okay. So utility is determined by inputs of consumption with different inputs of consumption over different points in time. So what we would have is like consumption today, C sub t, consumption tomorrow, Ct plus 1, consumption 2 days from now, Ct plus 2, consumption 3 days from now, Ct plus 3, and on and on and on, all the way up to Ct plus n, or if you want to stick with the notation I had earlier, we could call it C capital T, terminal point in time. So utility of consumption would really be a sequence of utilities, or really a sequence of consumptions that are chosen that yield utility of consumption at each point in time. U of Ct, utility of consumption today. U of Ct plus 1, utility of consumption tomorrow. U of Ct plus 2, utility of consumption 2 days from now. All the way up to utility of consumption in the last period. And we can add these utilities together to get lifetime utility. The utility over the time horizon that is previously selected for the model. And we get this right here. U of CT plus U of CT plus 1 plus U of CT plus 2 plus on and on all the way up to U of C capital T. There's a problem with this. If we just keep it as is, then what happens is utility of tomorrow's consumption is just as important to us as utility of today's consumption is. But utility of consumption 2 days from now is equally as important to us as utility of consumption today. Utility of consumption at the end period is, again, just as important to us as it is today. Now, you might go, well, yeah, duh, that makes sense. Why wouldn't that make sense? Well, imagine you're planning for your family. You have a certain amount of income today, and you need to figure out how much is going to be spent on consumer goods, how much is going to be spent on investment goods, or how much you're going to spend on saving. Well, currently, tomorrow matters just as much as today does. Or if we're thinking about planning with income for your family, let's say next month's income matters just as much as this month's income. There's a little bit of a problem there because this month, well, you've got consumer goods to figure out for your family. You have to go, all right, well, my kids need to eat X amount, so I need to spend X amount of my income today, or my income this month, to be able to feed my kids for this month. Next month's income will be used to spend on your kids' food consumption for next month. But that's a little bit down the road. Because if you plan out stuff right now, that's going to be very, very, very important to you. You need to be able to eat. You need to be able to pay your rent this month. You need to be able to do a lot of things this month that you do have to do next month, but next month's a little bit less important right now. If you've seen How I Met Your Mother, if any of you remember that show, there was a great episode where Ted and Marshall were talking about, I think, just blowing off studying, as Marshall was in law school at the time. I don't remember what Ted was doing. He's probably just being an architect. Like Ted Mosby, architect. Great episode, by the way. Different episode than this one, I believe. They're talking about basically just partying and getting drunk this one night. And Ted and Marshall are like, well, we drink a lot, we party a lot, we're going to get really drunk, we're going to wake up with a hangover, it's not going to be fun. And then I believe Ted goes, well, that sounds like a problem for future Ted and future Marshall. Let those poor slobs deal with it. That's kind of what needs to be going on here, but currently is not going on here. We need to let future Ted and future Marshall, we need to let those poor slobs deal with utility of future periods, but current Ted and current Marshall want to go out and get drunk. So they're more concerned about today than they are about tomorrow. All right? If you get paid this week or this month and you decide to just blow it all on whatever it is that you got, well, you're not very concerned about next month, right? You're a little bit more concerned with this month. So if, I get this paycheck from teaching you guys and I go, hey, I really want to get like an Axe FX3, which is a really cool guitar modeling thing. If any of you play guitar, great, it's awesome. You'll probably know what an Axe FX3 is. If I want to do that, awesome. I have an Axe FX3 now. But I'm not planning to put any of that into savings for like a rainy day fund in case, I piss my boss off and he decides to fire me and I'm without a job for like a month trying to find something else to do. So if I do that, yeah, that's great. I have a bunch of cool stuff. I have an Axe FX3, I get really cool guitar tones out of it.
but I'm not planning ahead for the future. I'm not setting any money aside for this rainy day fund. So things get a little strange there. How do I maintain concern for the future, but make sure that in the future it matters just a little bit less than it does now? Because tomorrow, or the next period, as soon as I'm in that period, okay, great, I can plan for that period and I can plan ahead. But there is a lot of planning that can be done ahead that can be, well, done ahead. It doesn't need to all be done right now. So tomorrow is going to matter a little bit less than today. 2 days from now is going to matter less than tomorrow, which is going to matter less than today. So to do that, we need to discount the future. So we have to discount the future a bit. Not much, just a little bit. Just enough to make sure tomorrow is not as important as today is. How do we do that? Well, we go discount the future. We do so by adding a discounting weight to lifetime utility. We'll call this discounting weight beta. And this beta is going to weigh down future utility like that. So beta makes this utility, makes tomorrow's utility, or next month's, next period's utility, matter a little bit less than today. Beta squared is going to make utility, oops, made an oopsie there, CT plus 2, not CT plus 1. Beta squared is going to make utility of consumption 2 periods from now a little less important than utility of consumption next period, which is a little bit less than utility of this period. So that makes us wonder, what does beta have to be? What does it have to be to make sure, oops, made an oopsie there. For the love of God, please make sure you switch those signs. I made a mistake on that. That's what happens when you don't have enough coffee in the day. What does beta have to be to make sure that utility of consumption today is more important for my consumption choices today than my consumption choices tomorrow, 2 days ahead, 3 days ahead, on and on and on? Well, if I want to weigh it down, that means beta's got to fall within a certain range. But utility still needs to be positive. So if utility's still got to be positive, well, that's got an interesting little thing added to it. Beta can't be negative, beta can't be less than 0, because if it is, utility isn't positive anymore.
So it's got to be positive, but as beta gets larger, as I increase the exponent of beta, beta to the first power, beta to the second power, beta to the third power, what does beta have to be to make sure that future utility is still positive, but it matters a little bit less than current utility? Well, beta has to be between 0 and 1. So mathematically, what I'll write is this. Beta's got to be in the 0-1 interval. It can't be equal to 0, but it can be anything larger than 0, but it could theoretically be equal to 1. All right? Economically speaking, this is a very feasible sequence that we could choose here. Here, beta is equal to 1. If beta is equal to 1, every single period in the future is just as important as every period is, or as today's period. But as beta gets smaller, the present begins to matter more than the future. So if beta is equal to 1, every period in the future is just as important as today is. But if beta is less than 1, the future becomes less important to us. The future doesn't matter as much to us if beta is less than 1 because we're more concerned about what happens today. Check my phone real quick. Make sure everything's good. Okay, cool. All right, so the smaller beta gets, the future matters less. Beta is known as a discounting weight, also referred to as a discount factor. So beta is called the discount factor. Now what that does is beta tells me the percent of the future matters relative to today. So if beta is equal to 0.95, tomorrow's 95% is important to me. As today is. So the utility of consumption tomorrow is 95% as important to me as utility of consumption is today. Beta is equal to 0.90. Well, tomorrow is 90% as important to me as today is. Excuse me. So beta is a function of our time preferences. Mathematically, beta is equal to 1 over 1 plus rho. Rho is the discount rate. Greek letter rho, not a P. Rho is the discount rate, and it measures how patient we are. Rho has to be greater than or equal to 0. If rho increases, we get more impatient. And care more about the present than the future. We care more about what happens today than we do tomorrow, the next day, next month, next year, etc. So if you want to go out and just get absolutely hammered, just totally trashed, well, you probably care a little bit more about right now than what happens tomorrow when you wake up with a miserable hangover. So if you go out and get trashed, rho is probably pretty high. But as you're like, I got stuff I got to do tomorrow, and I don't want to spend the first half of my day absolutely miserable trying to sleep it off, ignoring phone calls coming in, ignoring everybody that's trying to talk to me, ignoring all of the obligations that I had already established for myself, just screw it. Well, rho's pretty high. As rho gets smaller, you go, I do have shit I got to do tomorrow. So you decide, well, got stuff I got to do tomorrow. Maybe I'm not going to get totally tanked. Maybe I'll just have like a beer or two. I'll have a glass of whiskey at night, just as a nice little nightcap. And I'll enjoy my whiskey, have one glass, go to sleep, wake up, and not really feel that bad, if you feel anything at all. So rho tells me not necessarily how patient we are, but more how impatient we are. So maybe what I should do is change that to impatient. And rho is the discount rate. So as rho increases, beta decreases. Why? Well, because fractions. So because fractions, if the denominator gets really big, the whole number falls, gets smaller. Now there's something else that's pretty cool about beta here. Beta is bound by 0 and 1. So as the exponents on beta increase, it'll get smaller. So I'll say the discount factor will fall. Let's say beta is equal to 1/2, right? Beta is equal to 0.5. So tomorrow matters exactly half as much as today matters. Beta is equal to 1/2. Beta squared equals 1/2 squared. What's that equal to? Well, you square the numerator, square the denominator, you get 1/4. beta cubed, 1/2 cubed, 1 cubed is 1, divided by 2 cubed is 8. So it forces future choices of consumption, forces future utility to get smaller the further out we go. So today really matters. Today matters 100% of what today matters. Tomorrow matters 50% of what today matters. 2 days from now, 25% of what today matters. 1/4, 1/4 of what today matters is what tomorrow, or 2 days from today is. If I go 3 days, well, it's 1/8 as important. So it's going to keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller over time, the further out we go, because, well, why? We can plan for that when we get there. We can let those poor slobs deal with it. Let future us, future Ted and future Marshall, deal with what happens in the future. And the further out we go, the less concerned we are about the future. Now, we're still concerned, because beta's still positive. Right? It's 1/8, it's still above 0, it's just not as big as 1/2 or 1. So I will write out the utility function. I'll explain the utility function, and then I will call this an end for the lecture. So what is U of CT? Well, in this class, we use log utility. And the natural log of consumption. So utility is equal to ln of CT, or the natural log of how much we consume. So U of CT is the natural log of CT. Well, why is this nice? Well, it's nice because natural log of CT is increasing everywhere. What does that mean? Well, it means if U of CT is the natural log of CT, U prime CT is 1 over CT. Right? As a derivative of the natural log of some function, c, x, y, z, whatever you want it to be, the natural log of that function is, or of that argument, is 1 over that argument. Or the derivative of the natural log, of that argument is 1 over the argument. So the marginal utility of consumption is 1 over CT. That's pretty nice. Or, if you want to write it this way, be my guest. Might actually be easier to write it that way. It's shorter. You have to write less. Use less ink, less lead, less whatever. CT to the -1 is the same thing as 1 over CT. Well, let's stick with CT to the -1 for the second derivative of utility, which tells me the slope of marginal utility. Well, marginal utility is the slope of total utility. Second derivative of utility tells me the slope of marginal utility. Well, it's negative CT to the -2. So marginal utility of consumption is positive. The derivative of marginal utility, or the second derivative of utility, is negative. So ln of CT is concave. which is exactly what we want for a utility function. So the natural log of consumption is concave, positive first derivative, negative second derivative. We have increasing utility as we increase consumption, but it increases by less and less and less as we add more consumption to it. Boom, concave. So what will lifetime utility look like then? Right, because that's just utility in one period. What's lifetime utility going to be like? Well, actually not that bad. I'll say U for lifetime utility. That's going to drive me nuts, a little cloud of gunk. Ugh. That happens when you're OCD. Well, I'll have utility of consumption today, natural log of CT. I'll have utility of consumption tomorrow, but remember, tomorrow's utility of consumption is worth a little bit less than it is today. So I've got beta times the natural log of CT plus 1. I want to add it out for another day. Excellent. Beta, but remember now it's squared because it's 2 days ahead. It's not just 1 day. It's 2 days times the natural log of CT plus 2. Consumption 2 days ahead. I want 3 days. Beta cubed. Natural log of CT plus 3. So this is what we would get. Natural log of CT plus beta times the natural log of CT plus 1 plus beta squared times the natural log of CT plus 2 plus beta cubed times the natural log of CT plus 3. And this will go on and on and on. Now in the finite horizon case, we'd have beta to the capital T, ln of C of capital T. That's in the case that we have a finite horizon. We don't always have a finite horizon. Sometimes we have an infinite horizon. In this case, this is finite. Because the last period is capital T. You can write this in a much more compact way. U is equal to the sum, the summation, the indexed sum, as t goes from 0 up to capital T, of beta to the power of t times the natural log of CT. This is equal to this. Because if t is 0, well, the exponent of t is 0, which means anything raised to the power of 0 is equal to 1. Beta is equal to 1 there. T is equal to 1. Well, the exponent on beta is now 1, which means we just have beta. ln of CT plus 1, plus beta squared 2 periods ahead. T is equal to 2, beta gets squared, beta squared 2 periods ahead. So this is an easier way to write this. This is much nicer. Now it looks scary because, well, we've got that index sum thing going on. And the summation notation, I know when I took a lot of stuff in undergraduate, at least some of the first courses I took in undergraduate, if I saw anything with an index sum, it would scare the shit out of me. My brain would stop working. I pray that doesn't happen to you. But if it does,
and this is easier for me to say than for you to hear, relax, it'll be fine. Because I'm not going to let something like this be the reason you don't pass this class. That's kind of an ass move on my part. I always use a different word, but I decided to go with ass instead, so I didn't have to edit anything out, all that good stuff. Now, sometimes utility is infinite. Sometimes it goes over an infinite horizon.
So if there's no terminal period, the time horizon
then time horizon's infinite, there's no terminal period.
So if it doesn't end, we still get the sum as t goes from 0, but instead of t going from 0 up to capital T like we have here,
It goes from 0 to infinity.
this part's the same. The only thing that changes is what goes on up top on that summation notation there.
Here, time never ends. It just keeps going and going and going.
Here time does end.
It keeps going and going and going until it doesn't, and then it stops. And then we're at period capital T, and that's just sort of the end of it. Now, when you might think it's easier to have a finite horizon. If you got a 2-period model, it's probably easier than, 3-period models. So as the number of periods goes up, it may get a little bit more difficult, but the nice thing is, it does eventually end. But as you get further and further into the future, as we're looking at more time horizon, or a larger time horizon, it gets harder. Because there's stuff that we have to do, we have to basically maximize for every single period in time. I don't know about you, but I don't really want to do that. I'd rather maximize for like 1 or 2 periods in time. Oddly enough, if we're maximizing over some time horizon, if we have an infinite number of time periods, well, there's nice little mathematical tricks we can use that reduce that down to a 2-period model, where we basically just have today and tomorrow. So if we've got a 2-period model here, excellent. If we have an infinite horizon model, that kind of sucks at first, but we can reduce the infinite horizon model down to a 2-period model. And that is what dynamic programming is. Now, dynamic programming will likely come about 2 lectures from now, maybe next lecture if I'm really, really, really fast, but I would like to take this slow because I don't want you guys to get lost in the math, because then I have to go back and reteach stuff and everybody's confused. And, I really do you guys a massive disservice if I try to fly through it. I would rather go nice and slow, make sure everybody is capturing what's going on, and we can go from there. So, this is what we'll be seeing. We'll be seeing a little bit of this. We'll probably see more of this. Now, the textbook kind of switches between the two. I teach a method for doing the finite horizon, and I teach a method for doing the infinite horizon. The infinite horizon ends up being easier, especially if you don't really care for that much algebra and having to update all these time subscripts and all that stuff. So we'll be going through that in a little bit. However, for right now, this wraps up the lecture for this particular section. Enjoy the rest of your day, and you'll be seeing another lecture coming up in about a day or two, I guess. So, peace.